Good evening. I see people are still joining. We'll start the webinar in about 2 minutes. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Understanding Ag webinar. We have a real treat this evening. We have Burke Teichert. Burke is an incredibly valuable member of our team. He has an incredible breadth and depth of experience, having managed and operated some of the largest ranches, not just in the U.S., but in the world. And this evening, Burke's topic is turnout time. So in a moment, I'm going to hand it over to Burke. And in the meantime, please type in any questions that you have. And we will make sure and address all questions after the end of Burke's presentation. So Burke, turning it over to you, sir.
Thank you. And good evening to everyone. I usually have excellent internet connection from here, so I am assuming you hear me well. Topic, turnout time. I'm being just a little facetious with this, to tell you the truth, because we often read articles in the press and hear talks given on when is the ideal time to turn out. And I'd like you to look at the pictures on the screen now and tell me, was that a good turnout time or was it not? When is best? Or is there a best? And maybe a better question is, why did you turn in? In other words, why did you start feeding the animals rather than grazing the animals? And that's kind of the approach I'm going to take. Do either one of these slides look like good turnout time? And I could talk about either one of them. The one on the left taken on April 11th, 6,200 feet elevation ranch. And, but it had not been grazed for over a year. Matter of fact, nearly 2 years. And the snow was heavy that winter. And so most of the standing feed that might have remained from the previous fall was laying down. There was still some left in different places in the pasture, but it was still laying down. So anything wrong with that turnout time, or was it okay or not? The kind of questions we want to ask. Same on the right. That's in July, but that's when that pasture was first turned into that year. Now, turnout time. Can you graze all year, or except in real tough snow situations? The weather will sometimes skunk us. There's just no doubt about that we can't graze unless we bale graze. Some people windrow graze through very, very tough snow conditions, but to just graze standing feed, the weather can get to where you can't graze in the conventional way for sure. Now these two pastures, the one on the left, Picture was taken in June. The sagebrush on the hillside would indicate that it's a semi-desert kind of a ranch, low rainfall, maybe 9-10 inches a year. Happens to be a riparian area in the forefront that you're seeing. And certainly you could turn out in that riparian area. What about on that hillside? I think you're okay to turn out there too. But it hadn't been used. Cattle hadn't been in that pasture for over a year. So it had plenty of recovery time, which can get to be really, really important. That picture was taken on the same ranch that previous picture was taken in the snowbank. Not too far away, actually, but very same ranch. Just a little later timing. The one on the right, that pasture's been rested well over a year, and now it will be used shortly after the picture was taken here. So we can ask, okay, in all of those pictures, were there bad turnout times? Were there good turnout times? And how do we make that determination of when we should turn out? And then if you want to graze in winter, when the green grass starts to grow, and there's usually always something green, but it doesn't really start to grow in most places until sometime in late April or May. And when it starts to grow and we're transitioning from that snow into that growth, do we need to be concerned about turnout time then? Or are there ways to transition and just keep on grazing? You can feed a little protein. And in this case, it's alfalfa hay. And you'll notice in the picture on the right, they dropped some of that hay right in the tall grass that they wanted to get them to graze, and they will either graze or trample all that stuff while they're trying to eat that hay out of it. And so they can do an awful lot of good things for grazing and soil health while they're supplementing that protein. I used to tell people that when you're loading your protein supplement, whatever it be, whether it's a cube or hay bale or whatever it is, while you're loading it, you're a nutritionist. You're determining how much you're going to take. What do the cattle need for protein supplementation? Once it's loaded, become a range manager. Put it on the ground where the cattle impact and the use of the hay and whatever's trampled then will do you the most good as quick as possible. Picture on the left, picture on the right. They weren't quite framed up well, but it's really in the same place. So cows on the left were grazing in rushes and cattails and slough type grasses. It's kind of a riparian area in the middle of a pasture, and they threw an electric fence around it. A big pasture, range pasture with sagebrush, etc. And they threw electric fence around it and asked the cattle to graze it, and they did, and look at the distribution of manure and that kind of thing. Okay, with the question of turnout time, there's too many questions with lots of possible answers. And here are some of the questions, and I'm sure I haven't thought of all of them. You'll think of some more. Do you have both warm and cool season grasses? And do all of the plants come on at the same time? Even if you only have cool season grasses, do they all come on at the same time? Are you trying in your grazing efforts to be an adaptive grazer? I would guess the people who know about this webinar tonight are probably people that are acquainted with adaptive grazing, and that a good many of you are trying to be adaptive grazers, but that's a guess on my part. Do you want to encourage diversity of plants? Do you want to keep the soil covered? Would you like to graze all year long, or at least as long as the weather will permit, and go from there? How many paddocks will you use before you return to previously grazed paddocks? For your paddocks, what is the desired recovery period? And that'll vary depending on where you are. Rainfalls, irrigated versus unirrigated. Early season, late season, dormant season, every year. What's the desired recovery period for each paddock? And that's usually a rough number. It's usually not a precise number. Is it even possible to start grazing each of those paddocks at the best time? And that's probably the best question that I've asked there yet. Is it even possible to start grazing in each paddock at the best time for the plants in that paddock? Immediately knowing the answers is not nearly as important as knowing the right questions. If you ask yourself the right questions, you will learn the right answers for your situation or your context. Now think of this. In much of North America, 75 to 85% of the grazable feed is produced in 60 to 70 days. And this must be rationed through the rest of the year. Now, if you've got good rainfall through a sustained period of time, that 60 to 70 days is elongated significantly. And so you can do things differently in those cases in terms of your recovery periods. But still, we need to ration feed that's grown in a fairly short period of time through an entire calendar year if you intend to graze all year. Is it possible to have stockpiled grazing available into May and early June, and maybe even a little longer? We'll talk about that here in just a minute. And then, although the way we graze becomes a habit, and the pattern in which we graze becomes a habit, which we need to break, do you need to graze each paddock at the same time each year? Hopefully your answer to that question is no. Okay, let's start right there. Do you have both warm and cool season grasses? And do all the plants come on at once? I'm restating questions that I'd asked before. And I put 634 there because many of you who have been to our academies or have listened to our materials online or have done the Regen Ag 101, know a little bit about our grazing. The 6 principles of soil health, 3 rules of adaptive stewardship, and 4 ecosystem processes. And if you can make your practices fall in line with the 6 principles, and always remember the 3 rules, you will then be improving the function of the 4 ecosystem processes. And that just equates to soil health and getting things going and doing things better. It starts with, well, I don't know where it starts for sure. It usually starts with getting a little more of the rainfall into the ground. And as that happens, the photosynthetic period lasts a little longer and is a little more effective. So you get more plant growth, and then the mineral cycle starts to get better because there's more material there to cycle, and so on. Sunlight energy flow gets better because there's more leaf area to absorb sunlight and have photosynthesis occur. And when all of that starts to happen, then succession begins to happen and the variety comes. So you can graze all year long, or at least as long as the weather permits, if you follow the 634. One aspect of the rule of disruption: change the time and pattern of use every year. Give plants a chance to grow when they want to grow. Now go back to the questions at the top of that page. Do you have both warm and cool season grasses? If you do, and the cool season grasses are starting to play out and the warm season grasses are beginning to go, what's the best turnout time? That's a real tough question, and I'm not sure there is a best turnout time. If you've been in feeding the cattle and now you're going to put them out on the range or put them in a specific pasture. Let's say you're far enough north and west that you have very, very few warm season grasses. It's mostly a cool season, perennial range. Even then, those plants do not all come on at once. There's almost a 6-week difference in when they come on, from my experience of having grown up in the high elevation of western Wyoming. And so when would you like to be there? And I think we need to be careful about trying to favor one plant and hurt another plant. I guess I just don't think that works very well. I think we always try to go for more diversity, more variety, and try to get more total diversity in our system. And that's one of the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship. And that rule is a rule for a reason, because we know it works. So the plants don't all come on at once. And we have usually in many places warm and cool season grasses. They don't come on together. So we need to be able to graze in such a way that when we start to graze, if that's a time that's tough on some of the plants, we don't do it every year. Matter of fact, we may wait several years before we go to that same pasture, that same paddock at the same time again. We need to be particularly cautious about that at the times of the year when the grasses are wanting to grow. Give them a chance and make that happen fairly often. You know, we're going to work with a lot of pastures, a lot of paddocks, and especially those of you who get to using temporary fences, which we certainly recommend, and fairly short graze periods. As you do that, you have a lot of flexibility in the time of the year when you graze each pasture. And you need to change that up and make it work for you, which it can. And it takes away the dangers or the problems that can come with worrying about turnout time. You see, I don't think you should ever turn in unless you have to. By turning in, I mean start to feed the animals. And I'll grant there are certain climates and certain climatic conditions that you just about have to either reduce your grazing or bale graze, swath graze, or do other things in addition to just letting the cattle be out and graze. But we can work that into the system so it works out nicely, and we can change it up so we can encourage diversity of plants and still protect the soil, keep it covered, and have soil health improving. So I'm assuming now that you probably wouldn't be listening to us tonight unless you were trying to be an adaptive grazer, or what we call an adaptive grazer. So adaptive grazing means that you're pretty darn flexible. You're observant. You watch what's going on and what's happening under your feet or under the feet of your livestock. And then you're adapting to the circumstances that are currently there. You're also fitting that to your context, which includes the climate, the elevations, the markets, even your ranch goals and objectives. But to be an adaptive grazer, if you're working at that, then learning the 6-3-4 and learning it well, imprinting it to your mind so it's just a natural thought process rather than having to go back and regurgitate them. They just become sort of part of you, the 6-3-4, and you're considering them all the time as you're observing. What did the livestock do on this graze? What did they do to the face of the earth? What did they do to the plants? What am I seeing in the way of insects? What am I seeing in the way of birds? And did I graze that last paddock too severely? Or did maybe could I have taken a little more, and maybe even should have taken a little more? So you size the next paddocks more accurately in relationship to what you've been doing. And then you want to keep the soil covered. I'm assuming you want to do that too. And you can do that and still you can do that and still graze year round. You can be out early. It's just a matter of how you do that. In addition to the rule of disruption, don't forget the rule of compounding and the rule of diversity. It's interesting that in the 6-3-4, diversity shows up in every one of them. You want as much diversity as possible. That's one of the principles, the rule of diversity. And we just know what the good things are that happen. And then in the 4 ecosystem processes, you've got community dynamics or succession, and all of that, if you drive it positively, results in diversity. Now, when you think in the rule of compounding, and Alan has told this many times, there are no singular effects. In other words, you change your management to hopefully have a good outcome. And if you've done a good job of changing your management, things will begin to compound. There's not just one effect, there will be multiple effects, and then those roll on forward as they cascade on forward. And it continues for a long time until you change something else. And those effects are either positive or negative, never neutral. So if you can use the rule of compounding to make things move forward, diversity will just happen if you're doing things. It don't have to be perfect either. If you're doing things better and better as you move along, the compounding will be positive and work to your good. Okay. To graze all year long, make sure that you're grazing stockpiled feed when the grasses begin to grow. And I think this is one of the most important things that you can do. You know, you can look at those cows on the left. It's in the sandhills of Nebraska. Cattle might have grazed that again later in the year, but that's the first time they'd grazed it in this year. But when we were grazing it twice in the same year, that was usually too short a recovery period for that rainfall area. I think about half the times you could have grazed twice in the same year. There's some sub-irrigated meadows that could be grazed twice in a year. But most of the hill country, grazing it once in a year and then giving it a full year plus recovery. And why do I say a full year plus? Plus, because I don't want to graze it the same time next year that I grazed it this year. And when you get combinations of warm and cool season grasses and you want both of them to fully recover in that rainfall area, most of the time, unless you've had a wonderful year, is going to require a year plus to get that done. On the right is a place in Montana, and that place has changed from requiring about 30 acres per cow-calf pair to requiring 16. The owner tells me the cows are a little bigger now, and he's feeding less hay in the wintertime, quite a bit less, in fact. So he puts some of that up himself, but some he buys. But he says, I've easily doubled my carrying capacity and then the subsequent stocking rates. Now, that piece won't be turned into, he has an interesting approach to how he grazes that. And let me just tell you what it is. He has 2 ranches, a north ranch and a south ranch, but they're close enough to each other that when he moves cows from one to the other, he can trail down the county road to get from one to the other. And I'll call them a north ranch and a south ranch. The north ranch is larger than the south ranch, and so he likes to go there for calving because it's closer to home. He can check on the cattle a little more often. And so he moves them there for calving, which starts, as I recall, about mid-April. And so he'll take them there, and he's divided the calving areas into 2 sets of pastures. And he only uses one of them each year. So it gets to recover from the time calving is over until calving starts almost 2 years later. And then he'll start on one of the ranches in the fall, and he'll graze most of the pastures through the winter prior to calving time. Then at calving time, he moves to the calving pastures, and as he calves, then he will start pairing back to that same ranch, the one that he wintered on, pairing back. And by this time, the green's growing. And it grows more rapidly until it gets in about mid-May, and then it sort of tops out, but keeps growing until mid-June, maybe even into mid-July. And so he's got new growth coming amidst old standing feed, like you're seeing on the right side there. And so he's grazing that for a while until he's once through that entire ranch. Let's say his south ranch. Get all the way through it. And then he will start over. And now he's grazing regrowth that has occurred this spring. But now he's getting late enough into spring or early summer that regrowth has had a chance to get up and be pretty big. And so he's grazing that. And he goes until November. Then in November, he changes ranches and does the same thing there for an entire year. So the first ranch, the South Ranch, we call it that, it's in recovery that whole time until he goes back the following November. So he's doing some things to shake up the way he uses things. His paddock configuration is different every time. He has a reasonable amount of high tensile wire fence that's semi-permanent, but lots of temporary fence with step-in posts and polywire. And I think he last told me that he doesn't have a graze period that exceeds 5 or 6 days. And lots of them are not more than 2 or 3. And stock water's become an issue because he built pipelines, and they're soon proving to be too small. So when you develop stock water for better grazing, make sure you develop enough water, because I would allow that you're at least going to triple your carrying capacity if you're real good as time passes. And I might be getting close to through here faster than I was supposed to get through, but replacing fed feed with grazed feed. And that's the reason for my big desire to graze as many days of the year as I possibly can. But replacing fed feed with grazed feed is one of the most economically powerful things you can do on a livestock farm or ranch. Now, if these critters on the left can do it, our cattle should be able to do it, especially if we give them just a little bit of help once in a while. You don't very often see that, do you? Deer and elk in the same picture. And I don't know if you noticed, the deer are does and the elk are bulls. I don't know if those bulls were trying to find a harem of a different species, or if we just coincidentally found a good picture to take. And on the right is a sunrise. And I hope the sun comes up on a brighter day for each of us as we try to graze better and try to graze as many days of the year as we possibly can. So I'm ready to take any questions that might come.
So Burke, thank you very much. We really do appreciate that. And I see one question here from Ike. He says, "Hi, Burke. You were saying that you did numbers that you can buy in pregnant cows for replacements and sell heifers more profitably than keeping your own heifers. How can you get cows when you're doing that work for you in your own environment?"
Okay. That's a very good question. And the question I'm asked a lot, because most of you probably know that I recommend that a lot of ranchers, especially small ranchers, really ought not to be raising their own replacement heifers, but ought to buy replacement cows and terminal mate those cows to whatever end purpose the calves are going to go. You know, and if it's going to be grass finishing, why find a source of bulls that will make calves that fit well in that circumstance. If they're going to go to a feedlot for finishing there, you probably wanted a lot of growth in carcass. And so to mate them to terminal bulls and make your own replacement females. Now, I've done a lot of arithmetic on this and many, many times. And the only way that the guy who raises his own replacement heifers can compete with the person who terminal mates and sells all the calves is if the guy that's making his own replacement heifers can make a lot of heifers at a low cost and then sell bred cows at a premium price. And I've run them not side by side. There was geographical differences, but I've run both kinds. And in the same ranching family, if I can say it that way, the same group of ranches, but pretty significant spatial differences in climate and everything else. And the terminal ranches don't have that blank year. They buy pregnant cows, and those cows breed back reasonably well. And we can temper the kind of calf they have or form the kind of calf they have based on the bulls we breed them to. And if we're selling all the calves, we don't need to worry about maternal traits. We just need to get a good calf that fits the end purpose on the ground alive. And I've learned really pretty much cows are cows. Now, I do want environmental adaptation when I'm going to raise my own replacement females, because the higher their fertility that can be in my environment, the better. And as that and higher fertility with lower cost. And those cows do need to be adapted. If you're going to ask the cows to graze through wintertime, get pregnant next summer, they have to have some adaptation to them. No question about that. And so you can cull cows that aren't adapted, select bulls from the very best cows you have, or buy them from people that raise cattle in a way that you like, and do that. But the blank year is what you have to compensate for. And most people have that blank year that they have that heifer, but they don't take advantage of that increase in value up to about age 4. And then it holds its own till about 6. But they ride the cow down the depreciation side of the curve. So there was no advantage in working her up the upside of the curve. Now, I want longevity, because the people who buy replacement cows from me, I want those cows to last a long time for them. The longer, the better. But if I can sell them cows 4, 5, and 6 years old, that maybe you're calving just a little later than I want to calve or whatever, there's all kinds of ways to do that. But if I'm a smaller breeder, and I even know a bunch of larger breeders, that they go out and they try to find a few people, if you're real small, just one person, one breeder, from whom you can buy cattle, replacement cows, in an environment somewhat similar to yours, and from people who manage somewhat similar to the way you manage. The closer you can get that, the better. But gosh, I moved cattle from Nebraska to Wyoming, cattle from Nebraska to Oklahoma. And yeah, they didn't breed like the cows back home did in the maternal herds, but they were close. They weren't off too many percentage points. And it was a whole lot cheaper to buy those replacement cows, I said, not heifers. Buy replacement cows was a lot cheaper than developing replacement heifers in most situations. Most people spend way too much money in developing replacement heifers, and that's why you get the story. The cow she has to be with you 5 years to break even. Well, the way most people develop replacement heifers, yes, but actually you should be able to break even at any time, except the dry cow, the cow that you called pregnant, and then she doesn't have a calf. Now she costs. The rest of the herd has to help compensate for her. But if I can get a cow to 2 years old, and let's say that she comes up open, but she's got a calf beside her. If I sell her and the calf, that should cover her lifetime costs. And so on at 3 years old and 4 years old. And if you learn how to manage in that situation, I mean, a yearling heifer, our open yearling heifers were always profitable, and they should be profitable. Stockers are profitable, aren't they? What's a yearling heifer if she's not a stalker? You just put bulls with her, it should be the only difference in cost. So your yearling heifers, your open yearlings, they make good feeders. They should be profitable. But you've got to learn how to develop them at a low cost. And a lot of that is grazing a good number of months of the year.
So Burke, thank you. And now if you are, finishing your own cattle, things like that, you're carrying them all the way out, like we do, and many others do, then the situation can be very different versus if you're selling calves at weaning or selling calves at yearling. And I completely agree with Burke. If you are going to do your own heifers, develop them at low cost. Don't sweat the breed up. For instance, since we're finishing, then we can be real tough on those heifers and give them, we typically give them only about a 45-day window to breed. If they breed, great. If not, then they go into the finishing herd, and you make money on them that way. So there's a whole host of things that you can do here. I can assure you, people are looking for heifers, and bred heifers especially, that are tough, that have longevity, that have excellent soundness, and can do well in an environment. So there's all different types of options here. Now, as a follow-up question, Burke, for Mike, he does say that his concern is bringing in a disease that he doesn't have if he's buying in replacement heifers. So could you address that?
Yeah. And as I started selling bred cows, one of the pitches I made to a few of because we had a pretty large ranch, and one of the pitches I made to the people who bought our cows was that, where are you getting your cows now? And most of us, they were going to sale yards. And I said, how would you like, from a biosecurity standpoint, how would you like to just buy them from one source? And I think that's kind of what got them started buying from us. And then they liked the cows over time, and so they just kept buying. I had a couple of buyers bought a lot of cows over quite a period of time. We were calving in April, but I had people that bought our June, July calvers, and the ones that were bred to look like they were bred to calve in June and July, and then another buyer that bought our May calvers, and they just kept coming back. And so I think the biosecurity is and can be an issue, and that's why I think you hunt a little bit for the person that would have enough bred cows, to take care of you each year. And you can offer him more money for those bred cows to encourage him to do it. If he's raising his own replacements and he's doing a pretty good job of managing and breeding, and is somewhat similar to what you do, you can encourage him with pay reasonably good price for those bred cows. It's a cheap substitute for heifer development costs for most ranches.
Burke, we have another question. How would you recommend determining the optimum cow size for a person's environment?
Okay. First of all, color right cow. And to me, the list is fairly short, but open, dry, and hopefully the difference between those two terms sticks. Open, the one that is pregnant, is not pregnant when you preg check. The dry may still be open because you haven't put the bulls back with him, but she doesn't, you thought she was going to have a calf, and now she doesn't. So she either aborted or lost her calf, calving time, or through the summer or whatever else. But I want to sell all the opens, all the dries. I want to sell all those with bad dispositions, and any of those that take my time to take care of them as an individual. I mean, now if I have a herd health program and I'm giving everything a shot, why, I'll live with that. But if I've got to go out and catch them and doctor them, or bring them back to the pen and doctor them, or dart them and doctor them, I want to get their numbers. And I maybe can't sell them immediately, but they're on a next in line to sell list. And if you can cull those, and I found if you can cull those every year, you end up not having to cull very many for those reasons after a fairly short period of time. They're usually pretty good. So that kind of takes care of that end of the business. Now, the other end of the business is the bulls. And I'm pretty convinced that most people buy the same problems back into their herd that they were culling to eliminate. And so when you buy bulls, you've got to have your selection of the seed stock provider is really important. You got to make sure that their cows, that the mothers of the bulls you're buying are sized about like the cows that stay at your ranch with your culling procedures. And then make sure that they manage somewhat like you do. And too many seed stock places don't. And so I'm finding more and more of us are producing our own bulls for those reasons, that have good sized herds anyway. And so we're trying to select the mothers of those bulls. We'll divide our cows into two groups. We've got the commercials and the elites. We may not even define the elites until they're 4 years old or so, and they've calved each year on time. And so we want them to calve early every year, and calve early and have very good udders and good on their feet and legs and that kind of thing. And so we select those cows very carefully to get to be the mothers of the bulls we raise. And if you do that, and those cows are staying in your herd year after year and calving early year after year, the cow size that your environment will support will just happen, kind of a result of those processes. It's not instantaneous. It takes a little time, but you work through a generation or two of cattle and they will become more and more uniform, and I think more and more to fit the environment in which they're raised. Now, if you're a good grazer, your environment's going to get a little better with the passage of time. You're going to have more variety in that critter's diet. The Brix level in the plants is going to be higher. There's going to be all kinds of things that are treating her a little better without you having to do it in a supplement wagon. You know, she's just going to have you're treating her better so she can stand. You know, your environment's going to be a little better for her. So that maybe result in a little different kind of cow. And so that's why you just keep on keeping on. Oh, one other point to answering that question. In my cull list, any cow that raises a poor calf, and I don't individual weigh the calves. You can eyeball the poor calves. And what I like to do is I wean them and I set those poor calves aside. The next morning, I maybe dump them back in with the cows. And I'm a saddle horse cowboy, so no problem. As soon as they man me up, I just ride the pairs away. But, you know, most cattle people can figure out a way to get that done. You know, they man me up and tell you their mother. That's if you don't have them identified. If you've got them identified to their mother, why, you don't have to do that. You can just go find mama. But eliminate the cows that have the poor calves.
You know, Burke, when you talk about people buying the wrong type of bulls for what they believe they're selecting for in their cows, I've seen that many times. I can't tell you how many people I've had tell me that, you know, my target is a frame 4 cow, but they keep going out and buying frame 5 and frame 6 bulls year after year.
Yeah.
And we have to remember that frame score and mature cow size is an additive genetic trait. And so the offspring are going to be the average of the two parents. And if you keep buying bulls that are too big, well, you're never going to change the equation there.
No, you aren't. And the cows are going to keep getting a little bigger. If they were small to start with, they're going to keep getting a little bigger until they're the size of the bulls you've been buying over a period of years.
Exactly. So here's a really good one from Jared. Jared says, I'm in eastern Nebraska and we have predominantly smooth brome. Boy, how much do we see of that? And he says, we have some warm seasons that we are planting to get some diversity. It seems that most of the smooth brome is headed out and done growing by June 15. how do you recommend I manage grazing smooth brome to get the most out of it?
Um, I've thought an awful lot about this because your situation is not unique. You're not the only one with that. There's hundreds of people. And, you know, a lot of CRP acreage were planted into smooth brome. And there's some wonderful bromes out there. Smooth brome just isn't one of them. Some of the meadow bromes are pretty darn good. But smooth brome, I guess I call it a weed. Isn't that the plant out of place or something like that? You wish you didn't have it. But I guess I still want to buy into the idea that Mother Nature hates two things. One is bare ground and the other is a monoculture. And so I think you just recognize that you've got a lot of smooth brome, but I think you try to manage in such a way that you encourage diversity. And you can't be on all that smooth brome at once. You can't get enough stock density on that to use it all at once, but that's what's growing. And so you have no choice but to, can I use the word rotate your way through that. And at the end, it's going to be kind of sad feed. But I think if you give other plants the chance to grow, it'll take some time, but I think other things will begin to appear. I know people with fescue in the, in Missouri area. As a matter of fact, I partner with one and I'm very good friends with another. And it's taken time, but, and I always heard of fescue is what you have, fescue is what you're going to get. But they've got diversity in that fescue. Not as much as they would like yet, but they've got diversity. There's more plants growing in it. And I think when you try to manage for just one species, you end up shooting yourself in the foot. I think you've got to manage as if the polyculture were getting started and you want it to continue.
Gabe, you got some advice to add to that?
Yeah. Simply because I'm in an environment where that's ideally suited for smooth brome, with the majority of our moisture coming, of course, in winter snow and then May, early June showers. I totally agree with Burke. Using adaptive grazing principles, diversity will come slowly over time. But I also think this is a place in time we need to consider epigenetics. And what I've found, because we graze a lot of smooth brome, and the person asking the question is absolutely right in that smooth brome is only a nutritious forage for a very short amount of time. In saying that, with epigenetics, we have found that our cows, they either live on it or they don't. And now obviously we're not going to let them die, but the thing of it is, as we're several generations into grazing these expired CRP smooth brome paddocks, they just seem to flash easier and easier on it, even though it's a low quality forage. And so I think maybe, Alan, this is a point in time you can talk a little bit about epigenetics, because I firmly believe, in the work that Fred Provenza did, shows that if you, graze a cow, the embryo she's carrying on low quality forage, the embryo she's carrying will then be able to acclimate better to that low quality forage. And we're seeing that on our ranch, no doubt about it. They're doing better on that.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Gabe. Epigenetic selection is critically important in that regard, and it works with smooth brome. It works with endophyte infected fescue, and you'll see animals that are more and more tolerant of endophyte infected fescue over time as well. One thing I would mention is that there's a number of ranches that we're working with in like the Dakotas and Nebraska, Montana, places like that have a lot of smooth brome. And what we're finding is that if we can go in and introduce some planned purposeful disruptions using the rule of disruption, when that brome is just a little past boot stage. That for one of the things that we have found in working with a number of clients is that that's a really good time to sort of hit it pretty hard and then give a longer rest period and allow your seed bank to respond after that. So that's one of the things that we've been fairly successful with doing with a number of clients. Do we have any other of our panelists that have anything else they want to add to this question about the smooth brome? Okay.
I would make a couple of other points to that.
Yes, Burke.
And I agree fully on the epigenetics. There's no question about that. I think there are pure genetic variations where some cows just can and some cows just can't. And so if you can work at both ends of that, but your culling is going to work at both ends of it anyway. And so just get rid of the cows. They fail to breed. That's what happens usually. And there's one other thing that can happen. A lot of people now are getting into better grazing and doing better, and they're leaving the calves on the cow a lot longer period of time. And when they do that, most of them aren't, or a lot of them aren't pregnancy checking. They're just getting rid of the dry cows at the end of calving season. If she doesn't have a calf at side, whether she failed to get pregnant or she lost an embryo or lost the calf at calving season, they're getting rid of those. And that's a very nice cull strategy. But the thing it's doing, and it might even be the most economically sound, even if they were preg checking, is carrying those cows that were open in the fall, they're carrying them into spring, and you get this flush of brome grass. And so that could be right at the peak of your stocking rate. That's when you're carrying the most cows possible. And then you sell those dry cows and then you diminish your stocking. And that's going to coincide fairly well with the change in that brome grass. And you could have put a lot of pounds on those cows, those dry cows during that period of time.
So Burke, our next question is, please discuss drought management.
Okay. Interesting. I was a speaker at the King Ranch Institute annual symposium just a week ago, and that was my assigned topic. But it was a fun assigned topic because it said restocking after drought, soil, roots, and forages. Oh, interesting, isn't it? Restocking after drought, and then a big long dash, soils, roots, and forages. So they wanted me to address, what are you doing to the land in the way you restock after drought? Well, there's several points I made, then I'll make the same ones again. The first of all is, as you're going into drought, if you're doing a good job of grazing and you're having to make each paddock bigger, or you're having to move, let's say you're not moving daily, but you're moving, say, on 4 or 5 day moves. If you're having to move quicker than normal, quicker than projected, you're getting an early signal that you're not producing as much. Now, with good grazing, you can let it deceive you a little bit because you're maybe getting less rain, but you're still getting good growth because you put rainfall into the soil and it's holding out, it's lasting longer. But nonetheless, you start to read the signs. When I'm producing less, that means you need to begin to destock. And I'd say this, the quicker you start to destock, the less you have to destock. So you want to have groups of cattle at your place that you can destock with a little more ease. You know, you can go and get them sold, and you're going to beat the crowd to the auction with those cattle. Or you might even know a broker someplace. And I think I've just met some folks. They say, hey, we move cattle a long ways in drought from places, bred cattle in pairs from an area that is drying up to an area that's still pretty good. So there's those kind of options, but the quicker you start to destock, the better. And then when you start to restock after the drought, make sure the carrying capacity is ahead of the stocking rate. Carrying capacity being the supply, how much is there and how much is coming, and don't be too early. Make sure it's coming for sure, make sure the carrying capacity is ahead of the stocking rate. Stocking rate's the demand, carrying capacity is the supply, and you don't want the demand to outrun the supply. And I don't know that I can say much more than that. And then just graze the best you know how to graze once you start. But add back slowly. And then I gave several ways you can do that too. And I don't know if people are interested in that, but I just start with, if I'm a cow calf man, I'm going to keep more heifer calves back. And then if I make a mistake, I can sell them. They're still stocker animals, so to speak. If a few rains deceived me and I thought we were breaking. Another thing you can do, you can buy stocker animals that you can sell quickly, and can even buy stocker cows, dry cows, and put weight on them during that period of time, and something you can sell quickly in case. And given that, I would always advise in a cow-calf operation, never be fully stocked. You might be fully stocked, but you're not fully stocked with cow-calf pairs. You finish the stocking with yearlings or something, stockers, something that be quickly marketable. You always want to have a portion of your herd, whatever that consists of, that you know you can get off ranch quickly.
Burke, I would absolutely agree with that. And far, far too few people do that, you know, and I learned many years ago, just assume that there's going to be drought. Yeah. And if you're managing every year, like you're going to have a drouthy period and you're always leaving plenty of stockpile ahead of you, you're going to be ahead of the game 9 times out of 10. And, you know, so to me, probably the 3 biggest mistakes that people make are, instead of assuming there's going to be drought, they assume that it's always going to rain.
Yeah, that's going to rain.
Yeah, and then when it dries up, they keep assuming, well, it'll rain next week. It'll rain next week. So the first mistake, always assuming there's going to be moisture. The second mistake is not destocking soon enough, you know, and waiting and again, how many years have we had drought? You know, way too many to count.
Lots
and
of
yet
them.
we see ranchers still making that same core mistake of waiting too late to start to destock. And then the third core mistake that I see is the moment you do start getting moisture and just that tinge of green up, turning back out way too soon and letting them just nub it to the ground right away. And then you've really set yourself back on your recovery from drought, you know, quite a bit. So in my mind, those are 3 absolute core mistakes that are repeated over and over.
Yes, Alan. And then by leaving having plenty of stockpile ahead of you always, that correlates with the length of recovery period. And I think most of us as grazers, the ones I've known for years and years, the biggest mistake that almost all of us have made is recovery periods have been too short. It took us too long to learn. You know, and people want to say graze it all in stage 2. Hey, if I can't predict the next rainfall, I don't want to be grazing in stage 2. I want to be right at the edge of stage 3 and maybe even in stage 3, depending on the time of the year. I want those plants to be able to make seed, at least some of them. And, you know, so length of recovery and plenty of stockpile ahead of you.
So other comments from our panelists on drought management.
Alan, if I may, I'd like to mention clean, reliable water sources also on your drought management plan. We can get by with very bad quality feed for a long periods of time, but not without clean, fresh water.
Totally agree. Absolutely. Other comments on drought management?
I think those you cover very good points. key is preparing and assuming that it's not going to rain and having the best possible plan. And that involves diversifying your stack of enterprises and your different strategies you can muster up to mitigate those declines in animal performance and prices. Yes.
So Fernando, you have a lot of experience dealing in the desert where it doesn't rain very much. So in essence, you're almost always in drought management mode. So you know, give us your top 3 things that you do in the desert.
You mentioned it. It's always stockpile grass. You can never leave too much grass behind or residue. You'll regret it the moment you take too much off and you head into a drought. Having clean water and diversify your cattle enterprises. I cannot stress that one enough. I like to keep my cow herd always to be way below the worst possible drought I can withstand. And that's my limit. And the rest of my carrying capacity, I distributed with yearlings, stockers, or even custom grazing if cattle prices are not accessible and I have extra forage.
Yes. Excellent. Thank you. We have another question, Burke, from Sue. And Sue asked, to increase diversity, are you relying on the seed bank in the soil or would you seed?
On native ranges, I would rely solely on the seed bank in the soil. Unless it's just horribly sparse and has been horribly overgrazed, then you might experiment with some cover crops to see if you can wake it up. But on land that's been previously farmed or is being farmed, I would use the cover crops as biological primers for that soil health, and gravitate your way from there into perennial polycultures. And I think, Alan, your experience has been that using the cover crops correctly, pretty soon it's almost impossible to plant the cover crops anymore because the competition from the perennials gets to be too great for them. And they're coming from the native seed bank that was there from years ago. And we don't know, birds and wildlife might bring some of that seed, but it's quite a bit of it's coming from the native seed bank.
Absolutely. That's been my experience as well, that, you know, there's in most of our soils, there's still a pretty darn reliable seed bank that we can tap, but we got to build aggregate and we got to build mycorrhizal populations to really get it to grow well. And oftentimes you can do exactly what you said, Burke. You can go in there and you can plant annuals, not perennials, but annuals to sort of stimulate. You know, Gabe likes to call those biological primers, you know, to stimulate that latent seed bank, build a little bit of aggregate and get it going. Fernando, what would you do? Would you rely on the seed bank or would you seed?
I always try to use animal impact as the primary tool for land restoration. I really want to manage, to build that stockpile grass, to let it go to seed, to promote my new seed bank. But also I want to create enough animal impact to try to awaken the latent seed bank. And it's a slow process when it's really degraded. More often than enough, it's just because the conditions are not there in the soil for the latent seed bank to awake, but the seed is there. You just have to build organic carbon to a point where that seed will start to germinate and diversity will start coming in. I think patience is the key.
Absolutely. And oftentimes what I have seen is when people go in and try to seed perennials, before they work on improving aggregation in the soil and mycorrhizal populations in the soil, they often have failures with that perennial seeding. It doesn't work well. So Fernando's correct when he says patience is key here. Other comments from our panelists on this?
Hey, Alan, I was going to say, I think in a lot of our areas here in more of the non-brittle environments, I think it pays a little bit to actually, we've seen some of the native seed banks show up, but it does seem to be very, very slow. But a lot of these places are smaller acres, probably economically it might benefit to throw some of it out there, be out there. But same way what you've said, what we've seen, if you don't change that grazing management first, and get those, especially in our areas, getting these rest periods up to 90, 120, 6 months, which is unheard of for most of these heavy rainfall environments, you'll never see them established. But I think it does, I think we have it in the native seed bank, and I'm talking in Missouri, the Midwest, some of these heavily row cropped areas. I think it's there, but I do think we can really increase it by adding a little bit for not a whole lot of money, just putting it out there.
Thank you, Eric. Okay, do we have any other questions from our audience this evening? Or any questions from Burke from our panelists as well?
I would say one other thing about the native plants and native ranges. The native plants, if you can get them to come, are going to be the best adapted to your environment. Both epigenetically and genetically. They're just going to be adapted better. And so it's really worth your time to, as Fernando says, be patient and let them come. But the the other thing that we encourage quite often is let it grow outward from your best areas. You've got areas where the soil biology is working and doing good, and you're starting to get areas that are expanding and starting to reseed themselves. You can carefully move outward from those.
Absolutely. I guess one thing that I'll share real quick, and I just finished writing an article about this today that we'll publish, but what we've seen on a number of the ranches that we've been working with is in a lot of these ranches that I'm going to talk about right now are in year 4 of regenerative management and adaptive grazing. In year 1, the average aggregate depth was about 2 to 3 inches, and that was it. And that's when they started implementing adaptive grazing and the rule of disruption. In year 2, that average aggregate depth had about doubled. It had gone from 2 to 3 inches to about 5 to 6 inches. And then in year 3, it had increased another 2 to 3 inches in depth. And we started seeing in year 3, once it got deeper than 6 inches, that's when we really started seeing more of that latent seed bank response and more diversity coming in. And then in year 4, on a lot of these ranches, when we went in, and that was this year, we were measuring aggregate depth on a lot of these anywhere from 12 inches to almost 20 inches deep. So it really took off after year 3. So, and we've seen this quite a bit. You got to build the biological base first, that microbial foundation, and then you'll start to see exponential results coming after that if you continue to implement really good adaptive grazing. And what they've noticed in year 4 is almost an explosion of diversity coming in. So building aggregate depth is absolutely critical to being able to build that diversity in there. And so rather than focusing on diversity first, you really need to be focusing on building aggregate depth in the soil first. Then the diversity will come.
Yes,
Comment on that, Burke?
the diversity will come as a natural consequence. It's just going to happen.
Yep.
And once you start getting that aggregation down deeper into the soil, your rainfall capture is going to be much greater. I recall, and I've told some of you this story, but visiting with a fellow that I was newly acquainted with, found out where he was from, and I said, "How much rainfall do you get?" And he said, "All of it." Then he grinned, and he'd been exposed to our principles and what we talk about. He says, "No, I'm not that good yet, but I'm getting a lot more of it than I used to." And that makes a whole bunch of difference. You know, if you get 15 inches of rainfall and you've only been getting half of it or less, and now you're getting 3/4 of it, that's a lot of difference.
Well, it's a huge difference. And the other thing that we have to remember here, folks, is that, you know, with a lot of this diversity, particularly if we're wanting to tap into native plant species, and a lot of the grasses and forbs and things like that that are highly beneficial, they are highly mycorrhizal. And if you focus on building aggregate first, then that means that you're also building your mycorrhizal population. And you've got to build mycorrhizal populations to support that new diversity. If you're getting germination of these native seeds, the quicker that they can associate with mycorrhizal fungi, the better they're going to respond and to grow and establish. So again, don't get the cart ahead of the horse. Think about the right things first, and then the diversity will come as a result of that. Any other questions that we have this evening or comments? Okay, I do see another one coming in, Burke. So, okay, from Tim, do any of the panelists have any experience with the Blackland Prairie region of Texas? Do any of our panelists want to respond to that? So I'll start, and then if anybody else wants to chime in. So Tim, that's exactly like our Black Belt Prairie in Mississippi and Alabama. I've been in that country that you're talking about in Texas quite a few times, stuck shovels in it quite a few times, and it is pretty much exactly like our soil in the Black Belt Prairie. No difference. So I know exactly what you're talking about, and yes, I do have quite a bit of experience with that. And what I have found is with really good adaptive grazing management, it responds quite well. It will aggregate well, and it'll aggregate heavily, and you will see a really good latent seed bank response, but only after you build depth of aggregate. You need to build that aggregate at least 6 inches, and then you start to see almost an explosion of seed bank response coming on after that. It can be great land. It can be one of the toughest soils in the world if it's not managed well. But on the flip side, it can be one of the very best soils in the world if it's managed very well, managed regeneratively and managed with adaptive grazing. I have found that, you know, this is where the rule of disruption in the 3 rules of adaptive grazing really comes into play. You absolutely need to be thinking about application of different disruptions on this black land to really make it come along and thrive for you. Other comments?
Alan, that I think I've seen some of what you're just describing, but not in enough detail to bear testimony of it in that respect. But this line of comment has reminded me of one other thing. I'm seeing a lot of people try to do brush and tree removal, either by fire or chemical. And I guess I'm not going to tell them they're wrong to try to remove brush and trees in every case. But if you're going to remove brush and trees and not put good grazing in place immediately, you just count on doing it again. There'll probably be one retreat anyway. but there shouldn't have to be much more than that, because if you do it right, the grasses will get very competitive with the trees and the brush.
Absolutely. So Shane, I know you wanted to address how to measure soil aggregate. Shane, are you on mute? Oh, maybe. I know he was having a little bit of difficulty with his bandwidth.
Can you hear me now, Alan?
Yeah, there we go. We got you. Go ahead, Shane.
My internet's pretty unstable, so I apologize. Shovel. That's the best way to measure aggregate. Stick a shovel in the soil and see how deep down you go, and pull it up and look at the aggregation within the soil structure, and water infiltration rings another great way to measure aggregate.
Totally agree. Pretty easy, pretty cheap to do. You don't have to send samples off to the lab, and you can do it anytime you want to do it. So Shane's exactly right. Use your shovel, and we like to use a spade or sharpshooter, preferably, to do that. And so we've got another question here, Burke, from Leslie, who says, we bunched up our cows maybe a bit too much. We lost 2% to liver toxicity. We have yet to identify which plant caused this. Do you have any suggestions for us?
That's a hard question. I've had 2 or 3 questions come to me in the last few weeks, in fact, of that. One was causing bloat, and they just had way too much legume. Another, with the liver toxicity, that's kind of a new one. You know, there are a couple of times of the year when I don't want to bunch the cattle a lot, and one's during calving. I mean, I'm going to bunch them, but not in as tight of bunches. But I do want the cattle to sample a wide variety of the plants. And that's always kind of a tough question to answer. Usually, if they find something that's toxic to them, and there's availability of an antidote in the same paddock or the same pasture, they will usually find the antidote and select it. And I think Provenza's work kind of indicates that happens. Now, in every case, it's not, but I can't tell you what I would really recommend. Maybe if you bunched them a lot and done it quickly, I might ease off and then try to do that a little more slowly and see what happens. But I gotta believe that for most of the poisonous plants, there's an antidote. I mean, I've grazed cattle in thick larkspur and things like that, and not had much problem. Now, I made sure a good phosphorus supplement was out when I did it in larkspur, but I think they were finding other plants that were offsetting it. I think they would eat a little of the larkspur, and maybe that much of the larkspur might have been medicinal for them, but we didn't lose cattle in the larkspur.
Yeah, I think this is where, again, observation comes into play as well. If you're moving them into an area and you've got fairly high stock density, you really need to observe, what's in that paddock. And if there are plants that potentially can be toxic and you don't have enough diversity in that paddock, then you either need to move them out of that paddock, or you need to make it a little larger and incorporate more diversity, give them more selection. I'm not sure where you're located, Leslie, but wherever it may be, it's really important to just observe what's in there, and then take that into account as you build the paddock size and have, stock density impact. Let's see. Okay. Question from Ethan Burke. When supplementing protein on very rough forage, is there value in overfeeding protein 2 to 3 days worth at one time to keep the animals working on non-supplemented days? Or are you harming the rumen with yo-yoing their diet?
There's a lot of research to back up what I'm just going to say. But you don't need to feed protein every day, and I would suggest you not feed protein every day if you're supplementing just for the sake of the protein. Now, if you're supplementing for energy or TDN, that's a different story. But if you're supplementing just because you're trying to correct protein deficits in the feedstuffs you're asking them to graze, the research will even suggest that you can go as little as once a week. I prefer either 2 or 3 times, and I usually make that decision based on how much can I haul on whatever I'm hauling with. You know, if it's a feed wagon and I'm hauling bales of alfalfa, if I can get enough on that I can do it twice a week, I'll do it twice a week. If it's going to take 3 loads to supplement the amount I want them to have, I'll go 3 times in a week. Same with a cube. If you're a cake feeder, if you're feeding with those automatic dump boxes or whatever, if I can do it in twice a week, I'd rather do that than going 3 times a week. And I've found several things that happen doing that. We know the protein will carry over. They're not going to be there in the gut. They're not going to be protein deficient. The other thing that happens, their habits are just a lot better. They can't calendar skip 1 day, skip 1 day, skip 2, or skip 2 days, skip 3 days, you know, to cover the 7 days in a week. They just, their internal calendaring mechanism doesn't calendar that very well. And so they're not going to be waiting at the gate for the protein supplement the next day because you skipped that day. And if you've got them in a kind of a bigger winter type paddock and they've got a trail just a little ways, they're not going to, don't go there with the feed outfit and then not plan to feed them. But if you go there, you know, they're not going to come until they hear the feed outfit coming to them, and then they'll start to gather. So I'm a real believer in breaking it up, and started doing that many years ago. And the neighbors told me that's not going to work. They're going to be waiting at the gate for you every day. And now I just look at them and say, "You've never tried it, have you?" Because they might wait tomorrow, but that's the last time. After that, they're not going to wait again.
Yeah, and Ethan, it's so let's say you're needing to supplement 2 pounds per head per day of protein, and if you're not, and Burke is exactly right. There is zero need to feed protein supplement every day. I wouldn't do it. So if you're feeding every other day, then yeah, feed them 4 pounds. You know, if you're feeding every third day, feed them 6 pounds per feeding. It's when you start feeding them too much energy in the form of corn, things like that, that you're gonna have issues.
Yeah. I just figured out how much protein I wanted them to have per day, and I multiplied that by 7. That's what I want to give in a week. And then I just divide it by 2 or by 3 and feed the same. And I know that I got a little longer space between one of those and I do the other, but I never worried about that. I just, what I was going to do in a week and split it equally between the presentations.
Yep, absolutely.
And that will encourage them. I'll guarantee that will encourage them to eat the other stuff.
Yeah, it will. And the rougher stuff, they will be able to extract more energy out of that rough forage, you know, if you are supplementing with protein during that period of time. So other questions? These have been really good questions this evening. Any other questions from our participants? Well, seeing none and hearing none, we really appreciate, and Burke, if you'll go to the final slide here, sir.
I should have been there a long time ago. Sorry about that.
I do want to make everybody aware of upcoming webinars and workshops. So we have a webinar coming up on October the 24th called Monetizing Your Regenerative Advantage. And there'll actually be several of us involved in that from Understanding Ag. Our expert on vineyards and vegetable production and orchard production, Chuck Shimbry, is going to be presenting a webinar on November the 9th, Creating Healthy and Resilient Perennial Crops, Fruit and Nut. And then in January, we're going to have our first of a series of livestock economics, finance, and marketing workshops. These are going to be 2-day workshops that present very practical take-home solutions for increasing net profitability and economic health and soil health resilience on your farms and your ranches. So be looking out for that. And again, the upcoming webinars that we're going to be offering. We really appreciate everybody being here this evening, and we look forward to seeing you again at our next webinar on October the 24th. So thank you, everyone. Have a great evening, and we will sign off.